All right, we're checking back in with the Turd Nerds, and this time we're talking about soil sampling. The last few Turd Nerd check-ins, we've been talking about ways that we're analyzing soil in our lab, but we have not really talked about soil sampling. It's a whole process of its own, and so for today's Turd Nerd check-in, we're going to talk about soil sampling. Soil is very heterogeneous, and what that means is that it's not consistent from place to place. So if we want to measure the effect that a treatment is having on agricultural soil, well, that treatment effect could be very different in different places within a field. So how do we actually measure the difference? We have to be very good about how we sample. And so over time, there's been a lot of work that's gone into how to standardize soil sampling. And they've developed these sort of sampling probes, different sizes that maintain a volume. Every time you take a sample with this tool, this probe, right? Because the tube size is always the same, you go to the same depth, then you have a cylinder of the same volume in different places throughout the field, and you get a number of probes full of soil. And then you mix them all together, so you have equivalent volumes mixed all together. We're trying to homogenize. So where we came from heterogeneous soil conditions, now we're trying to homogenize them by having equal representation of all of these different soils conditions throughout the field. So if we're doing a large plot, maybe 100-foot long, 20-foot wide plot of land that we need to represent, then we may take 40 cores of equal volume, and then we put them all within one bucket and we mix them as well as we can to create a new homogeneous sample. This has equal representation throughout the entire plot, and now we can take one sample from this new homogenized soil sample to represent that plot. Now, this will continue to improve its representation of the conditions on that plot the more samples that you take there, but it may never be perfect because there will continue to be small pockets of strangeness in a heterogeneous agricultural landscape that may throw off your numbers in some way. So another thing that is done after years of study is to identify places where you might see strangeness that would throw off the overall representation of the whole plot and try to avoid those. So places where you might see things that are non-representative are rows where you've got a lot of machinery driving through the field. This creates a different soil environment because of what's called compaction. And so when you're sampling, you try to avoid those, because that's not very representative of the conditions for the whole field. Similarly, if you are applying some kind of treatment, let's say we applied manure in our 20-foot by 100-foot plot, but there can be some inconsistencies in the concentration level of that application, especially near the edges. So you want to avoid that space because it becomes non-representative. So when we soil sample, we deliberately avoid sections where we know from past experience that soil there will maybe throw off the rest of the sample. We try and take as many samples as we can. We mix them all together, and then we remove, a part of that sample for analysis. And we may analyze the chemical concentrations. We may be looking at biological activity or microbial populations in the soil, but we want to make them representative of the whole landscape that we're looking at, and that's where good soil sampling comes in. So every time that we're out in the field collecting samples, that's what we're doing. We're using good soil sampling practice to try to, as much as possible, turn a heterogeneous landscape into a homogeneous sample that represents the conditions for the whole plot. And that's what we've been up to, not just this week, but all weeks here in the Schmidt Lab.